Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors and improvers in supply chain management today, brought to you by AI Group.
Hello, I'm James Scotland. Welcome to Supply Circles for 2024. Many people are still on holidays, including many of the Supply Circles team. So this first episode of the year is actually a holiday special. It's a re-release of one of our most popular episodes from last year, my conversation with Louise McGrath on international trade and cross-cultural communication. It's a beauty, worth a listen. And here's the good news. The feedback on this episode was so good, Louise and I have decided to create a brand new podcast in 2024. It will be a monthly podcast that supports and complements Supply Circles, whilst also being completely different. And in the meantime, please enjoy this delightful chat with Louise. Hello, I'm James Scotland, and yes, this is Supply Circles, the podcast that asks the question, how can we in Australia create supply chains that are resilient and sustainable at a time when we're implementing the challenges of the 3 Ds? You know them: digitalisation to keep up with your peers in your industries, decarbonisation to meet your legal requirements and targets by 2050 and in some states 2045, and ongoing disruptions which come in many shapes. Not only pandemics, but also industry disruptions, product disruptions, logistic interruptions and challenges, global inflation, and so many more. Each fortnight, I delve into different sections of the end-to-end supply chain. I chat with fascinating and interesting people, and we try to have some fun along the way. Today, I want to delve into the issue that's important across the whole of end-to-end supply chains, and that's cross-cultural communication. The topic comes from feedback from you, the listeners, so I'm pleased to talk about it today. You know, we operate businesses and supply chains on an island at the bottom of the South Pacific, which obviously means at some stage we are going to have to do business with people in and from another country and in and from other cultures. And you know, it's easy to make mistakes and cause problems for ourselves and our businesses from accidental poor messaging or cultural faux pas, or by not understanding that the world sees itself differently and operates differently from the way we do, and it has different assumptions. We've heard examples of cross-cultural successes and failures in recent episodes with Melissa Anderson and Adam Blake and Ines Willicks and others. And from my own personal experience, I know it's easy to get it wrong, but it's also possible to get it right, at least most of the time. A while ago, I replied to a request from someone who I was doing business with in Eastern Europe, and they asked me if they could delay delivering what I was asking until Monday. They were due on Friday. They said, can I give it to you on Monday? I just wanted a bit more time to work on it. And I replied by email, sure, no worries. I got a flood of concerned emails almost instantly. When she was wondering why I'd had any worries at all, she said, we've been doing business for a long time, James. Why do you have worries? I didn't know you had worries. You should have told me you had worries before, etc., etc. And when I explained that no worries was just an Australian idiom, she was most unimpressed, I can tell you. And likewise, I recently spoke to an American student who lives in the same block of units that I do, or is living here. And I said, winter's coming, we'll have to go put a jumper on. They seriously asked me if a jumper had something to do with kangaroos. Now, I know they're just words and colloquialisms, sure, but they're also examples of how communication go wrong by very simple things. It's easy to stumble just by not understanding or by not knowing or by being aware. But it's more than that. When I was at uni and learning about this stuff, we heard many stories of when Americans back in the 60s and 70s were flying into Japan, had one meeting with a senior Japanese business leader, and they were leaving, flying back to America, thinking that when the Japanese had said yes, they'd said yes to that deal. When in actual fact, the Japanese were just saying, yes, we will consider it. A classic case of cross-cultural misunderstanding. So what are we talking about? Well, the basic definition of cross-cultural communication is how people from different cultural backgrounds communicate in similar or different ways from themselves, and how they endeavour to communicate across cultures. It's an interesting question, isn't it? So it all sounds a bit complicated. I think we should ask a senior business manager for her first-hand experience and insights from years in the global trade arena to help us learn and understand. So my guest today is Louise McGrath, a long-time world traveller, a multiculturalist, a specialist in global trade systems, and an experienced coordinator and facilitator of multiple overseas trade missions with Australian businesses. She's the head of industry development policy for the Australian Industry Group. She's a damn fine human being, and I'm really pleased to have her on the program. So hello, Louise. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
You've been travelling and dealing with the world for decades, well, maybe 1 decade, I don't know, don't want to age you. Have you got a favourite story of miscommunication in cross-cultural settings?
Well, I think there's lots. I mean, as you say, Australian idioms really do catch us up. There's a very famous one when Bob Hawke was in China and speaking with his counterpart and said, you stop playing funny buggers with me, or I'm not here to play funny buggers, which is a very famous, Australian term, though I don't think my 17-year-old daughter would understand it these days. It's not perhaps as current as it could be. And the translator very dutifully translated it as, I'm not here to play homosexual games.
I guess that's the literal, yeah.
It is literal, and I think that's one of the challenges. If you think of a dog, the literal translation of a dog is a canine quadruped.
Mm.
But you could also say man's best friend.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And if you're in a Western context, you'd think, oh yeah, that's a dog.
Yes.
So I think it's the inference that we put on words and how we use them, that sort of trips us up. I think we had one client, their brand, their trademark was toys for kids with the numeral 4 in the middle.
Yeah.
So then when they went to Asia, 4 sounds like death. Like you translate the number 4, it sounds like death. And so it's an unlucky number. You don't really use it. But of course, linking death with children is not necessarily a great marketing tool either. So I think, so it's often you don't know until you become global and you start translating your logo or your name that you can get into trouble.
Yeah, I remember the insurance company AXA, did a worldwide search to find a word that was acceptable in every language, and AXA was what they came up with. And it, of course, doesn't mean anything in any language because it was...
No.
Yeah.
And I think some of these tech companies, at startup stage when they have huge, big global aspirations, they work with these now consulting firms to work out what should we call this, what great name could we call this company that works in every setting, like Uber.
And of course, often businesses just start and then they start exporting and then they become global, and then you've got to try and figure out what to do with the brand, which sounds really good in one language but not necessarily in another language. It's a nice, interesting issue. Let's go back to the start. You're the head of industry development and policy at the Australian Industry Group, and you've sort of been involved in international trade for a long time. So I wanted to ask you about the US Inflation Reduction Act before we get over to cross-cultural. Let's talk about international trade. Our CEO, the CEO of Australian Industry Group, Innes Phillips, when he was on this podcast recently, he said he thought Australia was still coming to understand the full impact on Australia of the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is known as IRA. To remind the listeners, IRA is a $520 billion 10-year Congress-approved economic plan created and implemented by President Biden. It's designed to use the transition to net zero as a way to reindustrialise the US, to quote President Biden. And there's 2 key points to it. One is that they can't do it all on their own, so they're going to include their friends, the people which have free trade agreements with them, and that includes Canada and Australia. There's lots of opportunity for Australia for manufacturers, professional services and whatever. But IRA is also heavily based around subsidies. It encourages American businesses and consumers to buy US-made clean products, and if you buy those products, we'll give you a subsidy reduction. If you don't, you get charged full weight. And this Buy American is seen as protectionist by parts of the EU. So Innes suggests that there might be a blowback from the EU onto America. So with that context in mind, and picking up Innes's point, Louise, what's the state of play for Australia? Are we going to struggle with come to terms with the enormity of this, or what should we do?
So I think when the IRA was first announced, I was approached by DFAT and others to say, look, here's a great opportunity for Australia because, for that EV or the electric vehicle to attract a subsidy, the critical minerals in the battery had to come from an FTA partner like Australia or Canada. And so, great, this is going to increase demand for our minerals. And the problem is, though, processing critical minerals is dirty work. Lynas, an Australian firm, is having a lot of trouble in Malaysia in processing lithium. It's not, it has problems with local community support and environmental regulations. So a lot of critical minerals are actually processed in China. Now, this is a strategic play as much as it is an environmental play, that the US is hoping that by investing so much and moving the dial, that it will actually shift some of this production from China. Whether or not it comes to Australia or not is a whole other thing. I mean, we're not known for processing our minerals. We generally dig and send it out. And also we have very different regulatory framework than China. We're not a centrally controlled economy, so the government can't say, well, we need to process them here, come what may. The other thing is that that sort of hit that secret advantage we thought we had, along with Canada, has actually been diminished because the US has been gifting this around the region. So they've said to Indonesia, oh, well, fine, we'll recognise your critical minerals now as well.
Okay, well, you're into, you can play.
That's right, yes, that's it. So they're using it. I mean, it's getting a lot of attention as an environmental play, but as I said, it's more of a strategic play, and it's how they use their economic might in the region and to pull countries into their circle. And there is emerging, when you talk to anyone in the critical minerals industry, there is emerging a sort of a Western critical minerals market and then the rest of the world.
Well,
and
okay.
There will be a price premium. I think that, but key to that price premium will be traceability, because if you're buying your EV, whether in Europe or the US, how do you know that it's not being fueled by critical minerals that have used slave labor or, destroyed the environment and all sorts of other things? How do you know that it's, being processed in Australia with proper worker protections, proper environmental protections? If you're being forced to pay that premium, you want confidence. So digital supply chains, I think, will really play into this.
Well, I was going to ask you about digital supply chain. I mean, it reminds me of blood diamonds, and being stolen basically, and then sold on the market, and they're created by the blood of people in Africa. And an Australian company came up with a blockchain that made it possible to recognise where the diamonds came from. And the question is, blockchain's been around for a long time, so why isn't we don't have fully digitalised trade docs? There's an easy question for you, Louise.
Yeah, this is the challenge. I mean, I think perhaps because trade documents, are hundreds of, if not thousands of years old, because the old days when merchant ships and things, everyone wanted a piece of paper. We haven't evolved that much. COVID helped. But
well, I found out, by the way, that a passport was exactly that. It was a pass to go into a port. It was actually a bit of paper that said, you may now pass into our port. I didn't know that. But yeah, anyway.
So I think COVID's helped a lot, but, we like to have a piece of paper, but that chain of custody will become really important, I think, on these critical minerals, especially those sorts of fungible products. I mean, there's critical minerals in my phone. I don't know where they've come from. I don't want to think about it, frankly.
So are we going to see digital trade docs in the future?
I think so. This is driving it. I mean, one of the challenges, though, at the moment, there's no customs duties on the movement of data across the world. You move goods around and there's duties. Now data, why not? Like, some people are asking, why isn't there duty on data? Because, that people profiting from it. India, South Africa and Indonesia in particular are really strong on this. They're saying we're leaving millions of dollars at the door. We need to be, people profiting off our natural resources, which is our large populations and the data they produce. Someone needs to be paying for it. And at the moment, the moratorium on these data tariffs is under the WTO, but it's not permanent. So it gets extended every year. We need consensus. And every year, India in particular and South Africa hold us all to ransom while we try to navigate this. So there is a risk, frankly, that if data is applied to digital transactions, then we also have completely digitalised supply chains that will be paying twice.
And we're paying twice, yeah. Sure. Now, you can speak on this because you're involved in a number of international committees and organisations, aren't you? Do you want to just talk about that for a while? Because that's a great way to set up cross-cultural communication.
So I'm very fortunate. Within AR Group, I've been in AR Group for 23 years, and I started off on the trade desk and evolved into doing trade missions. My first trade mission was to Vietnam in 2002. And I've been very fortunate to take all sorts of trade missions of all sorts of industries, to China, to India, most of Asia, South America, right across health, mining, environmental products, construction, auto, printing. Anyway, so I was very lucky to do that. But one of the things with taking so many companies into these markets is you identify what are the barriers and what are the limitations. And that then helped me to move into trade policy. So I've been doing trade policy work at AR Group maybe for 10 years, 7 to 10 years, and then now in this role. So AR Group as a national peak body gets to be invited to a range of other meetings, of bilateral meetings. So, for instance, we're very involved in the B20, which feeds directly into the G20.
So that's Business 20. That's the Business 20 meeting before the G20. Ines said that he was the president of the Global Trade Council or something like that. So that's a very good
Global
title.
Business Coalition.
Yeah, that's a really good title. That's a very cool title. Yeah.
Well, my title's even better. So he's the principal and president. I'm the lead Sherpa.
And I assume that's a good description of what you have to do.
I think it is probably the better description, yes. Sorry. And so the Global Business Coalition, there's around 16 national industry associations of the top 20 countries, all sort of industrial associations such as ourselves. And we come together and compare notes and joint statements on things like digital trade, the health of the World Trade Organization, the role of environmental considerations in trade policy. And we also then are usually a key partner in the B20 host. So this year it's India is hosting G20, B20. And so Ines is on their lead advocacy council, and I'm on the task force for ESG supply chains.
Oh, wow. That'd be fun.
It is interesting. One thing, though, with the free trade agreement work, though, is much more detailed. And so I've been very fortunate that I've represented AR Group on a number of task forces for our different free trade agreements. So we had one for Indonesia, for ISEPA. And so there was ourselves, ACI, and the bilateral chamber, and in Indonesia, Apindo and Kadin and their bilateral. And that was really useful because it meant that the negotiators were putting forward an argument, and we could reassure the business community of things that we really wanted the negotiators put forward, such as good digital trade policies. And I think, ISEPA probably took Indonesia further than they were necessarily comfortable with in digital trade policy. I think it was really quite good. RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a free trade agreement with all of ASEAN and their FTA partners. So that includes Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, China, and India. So it's around half the world's population, about 6% of global GDP. And the East Asia Business Council, which feeds into the East Asia Summit, created a working group on RCEP and invited myself to represent Australia. So I've been working with that group for a number of years, and now we're in the implementation stage. And that was really insightful in understanding how these countries work together or not. Because, RCEP as a free trade agreement, the EU is 26 countries, but they're not that dissimilar. The differences between RCEP are stark. It's got every religion. There's Christian countries, Muslim countries, Buddhist countries, no religion countries. There's every form of government. There's constitutional monarchies, there's centrally controlled. There's every form of economic platform, like there's communist countries. free market economies, just everything. You couldn't get a more diverse group. And so the fact that they managed to work together to get a free trade agreement together was extraordinary. Actually, here's another fun example of.
But it is an indication of how cross-cultural communication can work. Well,
it can, but I'll give you a fun example of not a mistake, but I think it's good for Australians to remember. Like we say Asia, and that diversity, we forget about that diversity. But this one really, but I think we also forget that we have the advantage of seeing everyone differently. There was a session. So what we used to do is when there were negotiation rounds, we would organise a business workshop in the margins of the negotiation, so that we'd get businesses talking about their issues and the negotiators were in the room. Would time it carefully. So there was a session in Hyderabad, and I worked with the Confederation of Indian Industries to hold a session. And so that our local host, CII, which is CII is really the preeminent association in India. They're fantastic, and they are the ones managing the B20 process this year. So our host stood up and said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're all here. I really love working with Asia. I used to live in Asia." And I thought, well, I consider myself living in Asia. It's interesting you don't. Anyway, so then we had, and there were delegates there from Thailand, from Japan, from everywhere, and they all just nodded. Of course, yes, you're not in Asia. And then there's a whole series of rent seekers saying our industry is special and needs to be protected because. Mm-hmm. So when the 12th speaker got up, he said, "Oh, I'm the 12th man. I should be serving afternoon tea."
Okay.
Or the 13th man. Anyway.
No, 12th man.
Yeah. And I could see the confused look on my Japanese colleagues, and I leaned over and I said, I said, "I think this is a cricket joke." And he went, "Oh."
Insightful, Louise. You've got it right. You've got it in mind.
So I just thought, I think sometimes, and there's a lot more that Australian business community could do to improve our cross-cultural skills on working with Asia. But, everyone can. Everyone can do more, even those who are perhaps geographically closer.
It's interesting what you say, because years ago I was involved in a possible predecessor to RCEP, which was the badly named BIMPIAGA, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East Asian Growth Area. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get, you sort of need to look at a map, but there's a sort of circle amongst a whole bunch of cities, countries there that should deal with each other because they're close by. I was in the Northern Territory at the time, and we were trying to sort of get membership or get our voice in, and they're saying, well, you can't because you're not part of that growth area, nor are you in Asia. But the way that you explained before, where you can have their MOUs and their partnerships involved, that's much better. But what did jump out at me when you said that is that at the time, there was Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines. Well, there was parts of Indonesia that was fighting with the Philippines. Like parts. Like Mindanao was fighting with West Timor, I think, like physically fighting, and we're trying to do a trade deal. It's interesting when you say Asia, even Southeast Asia, there's nothing homogenous about it at all. And was Muslim versus Christians being another fundamental issue.
Well, just think, how are these countries coming to the table and negotiating as equals? You've got Myanmar, which is still one of the poorest countries I've ever been to. I just think every broken old mobile phone is there for sale. Like it's just the end of the line. Standing there in their own right next to Japan. That's the extraordinary thing. I think that's the thing with trade is that countries get to, they've all got a vote. They've all got a shared vote or an equal vote, rather.
The other thing we don't always recognise is I was in Thailand, Thailand, and we went to some ruins. And the ruins were caused by a battle they had with the Burmese like 5,000 years ago, a long time ago. And you say, this guy's been fighting for much longer than what the Western history is that we've been talking about. There's deep stories here. Yeah. And that must happen all around the world. That's part
of course.
That must be part of the European, apparently if you say the French, we won the war. They say that's just the last war. We won the 400 war. How did I wanted to ask you about the free trade agreements. You said you're on the free trade agreement task force. Are free trade agreements still a thing, or are we just throwing all that sort of rules-based order out the window and there's a free-for-all now between the US and Russia and everybody else?
No, they're very much a thing, but the problem is that the WTO isn't as strong as it should be, and I think that's because people have different views. Like, what is the purpose of the WTO? I think a lot of people, when China joined, they just thought, great, China's now going to become a democracy, as if the WTO is just sort of some homogenous washing machine where everyone goes in this different and comes out the same. Whereas I've always seen the WTO as the way for differences, for people with differences to work together and to talk together and to find solutions.
Well, the concept of the WTA was that you don't fight if you're trading. That was like, and taking away might from right. So there's a right way of doing it, and not just the big guys are going to win. That was the idea of the WTA.
That is, but the challenge is it does have a consensus model. So as I mentioned with the digital trade rules, India can be a holdout, and until they sign on,
you don't have a consensus.
We're all held hostage.
Yeah, right.
So there is a big trend, which I don't know if you send links, but we do have Jeff and I wrote a nice report on the big 5 trends of trade.
And Jeff being Dr. Jeff Wilson, the chief economist of AI Group.
That's right. One of the sort of big 5 trends is this Plurilateral Trade Club. So CPTPP, which was the old TPP, countries are lining up to join. UK has just joined. Hopefully South Korea does.
Yeah, UK joining is a different story, isn't it? It just changes things altogether.
That's right. So it stops being a Pacific. I mean, I'm not sure it makes sense for them to join. But anyway, once more countries. So this is the thing that, as WTO becomes disempowered, people have always, you want rules. No matter who you are, you need rules to play by. Even if you know which ones you can break, you need some consistency and some confidence. And so they're just signing up to find their own rules. And CPTPP is probably the most advanced in terms of having good rules on digital trade, on services, on state-owned enterprises and the like. It's a pity the US can't join and won't join, but the rest of the world is lining up.
Again, it does change the fact that the US decided not to go ahead, which is to change everything altogether.
But I think what's really interesting, when the US left, everyone thought, well, that's it, it's finished.
Yeah, I did.
But what's really interesting to me is the way Japan stood up and got it through and used their regional power, because they don't do it often. So after World War II, Germany and Japan took very different approaches. So Japan was sort of, this never happened, let's never talk about it again, let's just move on, which, truth and reconciliation doesn't always, that's probably not really aligned. Whereas Germany was like, we did this, we acknowledge it, pay for our sins forever. Yep. So honestly, the region has sort of used that against Japan. I've been in many conversations on East Asia where, the Chinese delegate said, oh, well, there you go, there's imperialist Japan acting like that again.
Goodness.
Never forgiven. So they're very sensitive to standing up and taking a leadership role. And I think it's really, really exciting that's, Abe did a fantastic job in getting that over the line.
This is setting up perfectly, because you've sat in these meetings where people from totally different cultures are trying to find a way to communicate. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I think it's worth talking about the fact, how did a young girl from country Victoria end up in walking the world stage and trading meetings?
Well, I studied Arabic at university at Deakin, and
as everyone does, Arabic. Yeah.
I did Indonesian up in year 12.
By the way, Arabic's different from the Arab language today, I assume. It's like Greek, like Rome versus Italian.
Oh, no, no, I didn't really learn. It's not as if I learnt Latin, but Arabic, the what's called Fusha, this formal standard Arabic that's written down is sort of what newsreaders use, official documents use. Uh-huh. What everyone speaks in their own country, their own dialect, is not written down.
Ah, okay.
So that's how they've...
And you studied both of those, I guess.
Well, at university, you really only study the formal, the formal
Right.
Arabic.
Mm.
But I'll just age myself anyway. So 91 was my first year uni. 92, the summer of 92, I went to Jordan for 6 weeks to study in Irbid University.
Clearly a child prodigy.
So I learned a bit of the local dialect, and then a few years after that, I went as a private student to Alexandria University in Egypt. And I learned
Oh, wow. Were you the only were you the only European there, or was there other people there?
No, so this is a special language school in Europe. They have it's mandated that if you're studying a language, you spend a year in the country. And so they created Oxford. So there was British universities, Oxford, someone and a couple of others, Exeter and someone else. They'd created this language school in Alexandria. But I also did Indonesian in year 12, which is the peak. Those 80s is when a lot of Australian students did Indonesian. Unfortunately, those numbers have really slashed, which is unfortunate. Anyway, so I studied Arabic and, spent some time, and then and the course was Arabic language and culture, so, the history of the Middle East, etc., which is the cradle of civilization.
Yeah, sure.
Well, Western civilization anyway. And I did all sorts of things. I was in the UK, and then came home, worked in foreign exchange, insurance, etc., and then joined AI Group on the trade desk. It's very junior, doing certificates of origin. And certificates of origin, well, in those days particularly, was the best place to learn about trade because, members never call with good news. But on the certificate of origin desk, even less so. There's problems after problems, which is how you learn.
One of the interesting things about cross-cultural communication is that if both sides, like any communication, both sides are really intent on understanding each other, it's possible. It's the art of the possible. It's when people are trying not to understand each other that happens. When you were a youngish woman in Alexandria or somewhere, you must have been able to. It would be right to say that you were able to get yourself understood quite easily because people would look favourably to you trying to speak the language? What was your experience?
Oh, yes.
I guess what's your experience?
Well, it's a bit of novelty, of course. I mean, I remember once in Jordan, like just to illustrate, like being in Irbid was a bit like being in Deniliquin or Dubbo or, any other towns. Any other regional
out in the
town.
sticks, to use an Australian colloquialism, yes.
Yeah, that's it. And I remember once in Amman I was, and so for 6 weeks, I only saw people who looked like Jordanians because that's all I was surrounded by.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the fellow students I had. And I remember once being in an ice cream shop and I could, there was a mirror at the back and I thought, goodness, who's that strange looking creature? And it was me. Like I just had almost forgotten what I looked like. So it made me really understand why representation matters and what it must be like for people who only see white faces everywhere in leadership. It's really informed. I just think living overseas really just informs a whole lot of things across your life. But yes, I was a novelty. So little kids would stare at me in the street because there's not many Westerners between the two Gulf Wars in Jordan.
Yeah. And being the novelty means that people were willing to sort of engage with you and try and understand.
Oh, yeah. I could get away with anything.
I have a funny story. I was in a small Roman town in northern Spain. I'd been cycling and I ended up in this town overnight, and the lady that was supposed to be there to meet me had gone to a concert and her father was there. So there was just this sort of 60-year-old man there looking after a hotel. And he tried to speak Spanish. I didn't speak Spanish. I tried to speak English. He didn't speak English. We got nowhere. And then he finally looked at me and said, "Beer?" And I said, "Yeah, I get." And I thought, "Oh, there's the international language right there."
Yeah. Well, I did a lot of sign language because when I was living in Egypt, I was a student. It was an apartment, and to buy a hose to connect the washing machine. Like I'm trying to do. Like, how do you? I think it's those things. Like trying to communicate broadly is a bit easier, but when you get to details, like I remember once I had a trade show in Japan and there was a little bit of assembly required. I thought, how can I ask if they have a Phillips head screwdriver? So I had, because I couldn't travel, so I just did do you have a screwdriver with this on the tip, and just did a cross? And they went, yes. Because I was pretty sure in Japan they wouldn't have called it a Phillips head screwdriver.
No, I don't know why we call it a Phillips head screwdriver. Someone will probably write it and tell me why, but I've got no idea. Let's take a break and come back and talk about cross-cultural communication. Before we do, I must acknowledge that you are actually the project champion of this podcast. You're the one that pays my bills, so thanks very much. Do you listen to any podcasts? What do you what podcasts do you enjoy?
Oh, separate to this one, of course.
Sure.
Well, now that I don't, I'm since COVID, I don't listen to as many podcasts because I used to walk to work, and now
should point out that you live in Melbourne, so COVID is a big deal for you. Yeah.
That's right. So I don't walk as much because I ride my bike anyway. It's all convoluted. There's I like the trade guys. I like trade _ whatever it's called, Trade Talks. I like Chats.
I listen to Trade Talks. Trade Talks is really good. If you don't know about the free trade, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, they're all over it. It's good. Yeah.
There's a new one that I'm really enjoying called Empire, which is by William Dalrymple, who wrote the history of East India Company in India and that sort of stuff. Started off with the East India Company, and now is broadly on empires and around the world, slave trade and something. That's always very interesting. Fun one though I really like is Normal Gossip.
Normal Gossip. That sounds good.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun. We listen to it as a family. We have to drive somewhere because we find driving soporific. So it's just people write in, crazy stories of the time they ended up going to a concert with two people they didn't really know, and all the problems with the motel charges and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, right.
Just random
stories.
Random stories that everyone has experienced, and
it's humanity, though, isn't it? It's just you're touching humanity.
It's a common experience, and so we're yelling, don't go. Anyway, so and also the other one, sort of prosaic one, is Everything is Alive. I like that one too. Everything's Alive. So interviewing playing cards, interviewing an aluminium can who hopes to grow up to be in an aerospace wing.
I have to grow up to be a satellite. Yeah,
that's it.
Well, look, we've gone off track again. Let's take a short break, come back and talk about cross-cultural communication.
Okay.
If you have supply chain or business improvement challenges, contact AI Group's Business Improvement and Growth Hub. The Big Hub is a library of practical and relevant resources designed to assist member businesses to grow and improve. The Big Hub also includes an extensive network of experienced pre-qualified business improvement consultants. For more details, contact big@aigroup.com.au. That's big@aigroup.com.au.
Louise, before the break, you mentioned East India Trading Company, and I was thinking about this in preparation for this conversation, because business people have always sort of talked cross-culturally, haven't they? I mean, East India was set up to trade. Then the sort of diplomats and the empire builders came in and changed the language completely and made it much more, patriarchal and controlling. But business has this approach of cross-cultural equanimity. Would that be fair?
Well, I just think for a lot of we've talked a lot about exporters, but for many of our members, once the manufacturing sector was sort of diminished in Australia, sort of that the low-tech, low-skilled manufacturing moved offshore when we deregulated, all our companies who are in that high-tech, high-skilled manufacturers who have exports have doubled over the last 20 years, they have relied significantly on imports. So a lot of our members, their first foray overseas is not as a seller, but as a customer, which immediately changed the power differential.
Go and find a supplier, yeah.
That's right. But so while it does change the power differential, and you might say, well, does it really matter how cross-cultural you are? I think, I think some I've gone to some cross-cultural training, for example, and they say really unhelpful things like you shouldn't touch people's heads. Well, I managed to go through life many days in meetings without touching people's heads. I mean, it's unlikely you're going to touch, they're not very helpful. But I think
what?
they say it's a faux pas. Well, of course it is. But you say that, but then people give gifts of football beanies and start putting them on people's heads.
Yeah, at least that's in context, though. That's in context as opposed to just
I know,
go and touch someone on the head.
But I think if you're a buyer, it's actually more important because, I spoke to one customer, one member who was getting couches made, for example. They were thinking, should we, for us, our low-end stock, get it made in China? So they sent off the plans to China and it came back and it was kind of rubbish. It was just sort of plywood. So their feedback to the company in China was, it just doesn't feel heavy enough. Because, a good couch, feels heavy.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so then the next sample came across and it certainly felt heavier. And they ripped off the back and they realised that there were sort of 20 bricks strapped inside. But this is the thing, like communication isn't so much getting the words out, but getting the meaning across. Getting things right when you're the buyer is just as important.
Well, part of it is that power differentiation. And I was telling people that I was in Morocco recently and I caught a taxi and the taxi driver took me on a detour. Of course, we were chatting and he said, well, let's go down here. And everyone I spoke to was horrified and said, how could you do that in the middle of the night, go on a detour? And I said, well, mainly because I'm a middle-aged white male and the world's designed around me. I don't have a problem traveling. Everyone else has got issues to worry with. Regardless of what situation you're in, there is a power differentiation you need to be aware of, and it's more so in cross-cultural, I would think.
I think so. I've been in situations where very senior people when I'm quite young, as a young woman, in a culture where, it's a very patriarchal society, Japan and the like. But I always deflect with humour. I always find, but though, as at the start of this podcast, we talked about sometimes humour doesn't work. I remember many years ago opening that trade show in Japan, and they put a big bow on my lapel, and then they said, this means you're VIP. Oh. And I said, I thought this meant I'd have to serve the drinks. And they were so horrified.
Oh, no. Yes.
And they wanted to, because they were so conscious of the ill placement of me in the sort of the hierarchy, they were so, desperate to reassure me that, no, I was not serving drinks. But
it's easy to just get that wrong. And that leads us to another part of cross-cultural communication, which is called social norms. And there's many things that we do. Everyone does stuff they know that's unspoken. And a nice way of trying to explain a social norm is if I said to someone, we're getting together on Friday, bring beer. We're getting together on Friday, and they said to someone, well, what do you do in Australia if there's a get-together? They'd say, bring beer. But what about if we're getting together at 6 a.m. in the morning? Someone would turn up with beer and we'd go, and we'd kind of we'd look to frown on them. And there's a whole bunch of different stories about how close you stand to each other, how loud you talk, how quietly you talk, how formal you talk. There are the social norms. It's hard to understand social norms in another culture, though, isn't it? And you can do a social faux pas like the bow.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, I think it's easy to just be observant. I think that's the key. It's being, as it is in any. I mean, even if you go to visit someone's home when you're a kid, some families leave shoes outside, some wear them inside. You just pay attention. You just notice what people are doing. Keep your hands to yourself is just a good rule, I think, in any culture. You can't go wrong with that.
I mean, it's just a good idea. Yeah.
And I just find sometimes in terms of getting cross-cultural communication right, it's just time. I mean, when I first started going to Japan, very formal, but then somehow after year 4, I was greeted with a hug. Which,
okay.
Broke my own social norms. But anyway, because it was now you're in the club.
Yeah,
you now.
Yeah, sure. Sure. And you're allowed to make mistakes when you're first developing. If you don't, unless you do it really badly, you can make those sort of crazy mistakes. And most people I find recognise that there's been mistakes on both sides when it comes to that kind of cultural misunderstanding. Everyone just sort of goes, okay.
I think the thing is, though, when you're working international trade, chances are most of the people you interact with are also in international trade. So you're not dealing with the stereotypical, sort of monk in the monastery sort of thing. These are people who are exposed to the world and have probably studied.
American tourists being way too loud.
Well, that's right, except for the Americans. But particularly in Asia, you're generally dealing with people who have perhaps studied overseas for whatever time period, have got a bit more experience and a bit more sort of awareness. I think for me, though,
But what are they when you're doing those trade tours? I mean, that must be business to business. A lot of those businesses wouldn't have been to Australia or been overseas. They would just be running their own local business.
No, but what I find, if they're big multinationals, then they probably do, and there's a whole other power differential. When people work for those big, especially big American companies.
Well, that's a different culture altogether, by the way.
I feel like we're bashing on Americans too much. Anyway.
It's a different culture, though, isn't it? I mean, it's not just...
That's right. So that overlays whatever country culture. But, I'd never forget going to see GM in Thailand, worst meeting I've ever been in my entire life. Where they
this will be good.
Said,
normal gossip. Let's go.
That's right. He's all good. You Australians will never sell to us. You'll never be cheap enough. Why are you wasting our time? You're dreadful. It was awful meeting. But where was I going off? Yeah. So I think those business to business, if they're family owned companies, you get the head of the families talking together, then business gets done.
And they get it.
And they meet each other because it's shared values, shared power. They control the decision. They're the ones, handshake is enough.
Yeah.
So over the years, those sorts of companies I've always enjoyed taking because they send the person who can sign the check and they do a lot of work.
I think there's a really good insight because it contrasts with that. I don't know if you know, have you come across the Barbie? I haven't mentioned Barbie on the podcast before. Have you come across the Barbie movie controversy? Vietnam has banned the highway, the Barbie.
Yeah, because the 9-dash.
Yes, there's a 9-dash. There's a map behind, I guess, Barbie at some stage. There's some sort of scene where there's a map of Vietnam and it looks like.
Well, it's sort of not really. It's just over Asia. But anyway, yeah. When I watched the movie, because I knew the controversy.
Oh, you've seen the movie?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I knew the controversy and then, went to see the movie and it was just, it's people looking for trouble.
So just to find it, so there's a map somewhere on a wall that's got Vietnam on it.
They say, they said this is the world.
Oh, right.
And because of Asia Pacific is quite big, so it's a children's cartoon map.
And Vietnam has said, no, you make us look like we're part of China. Is that basically the...
I think so.
Yeah. So the people that made the Barbie movies didn't mean that, didn't intend it, and probably pretty surprised.
You really had to look hard. Anyway, but it just shows these things happen and you don't realise unintended consequences.
Yeah. And people are touchy about all sorts of things. They get touchy. They're crazy.
Yeah, South China Sea's pretty touchy.
Yeah. Have you just mentioned America before? Do you find American and Australian cultures are closely aligned?
I think.
I mean, is it easy to do business with America? I must find it is reasonably easy, but they tend to be a little bit more aggressive in their approach to business. They go after business harder.
I think we see the Americans as more ruthless, and they think, "What are you talking about? I'm just doing business." They will. If you leave a door open, they'll go through it. They're not. It's not personal. I think Australia relationships probably more Asian than we like to think. Relationships probably mean a bit more. But I'm always hesitant to say, relationships, you can't go to this market unless you have quality product and, you invest in the relationships. Because frankly, I'm yet to find a market that will take dodgy products off strangers.
We should wrap up. This has been a great conversation. Going back to sort of a worldview, we've seen that some problems around the world, and we've seen trade go up and down. We've seen, blockages put in place. What do you think is going to happen over the next few years? Are we going to come together as one great big melting pot and be all friends again, or are we going to become more insular? How's it going to happen?
Well, I think I think trade will always be there. People keep talking about the end of globalisation. I think that will never happen. I mean, the Productivity Commission, who is hard taskmasters, they did a review of China's sanctions on Australian products, made no economic difference. I mean, there was that golden moment, particularly for those of us in Victoria who had cheap lobsters one Christmas. But for everything else, other than for the individual, individual companies would have suffered in all sorts of different ways, particularly wine growers or wine sellers. But if we think of barley, for example, that the sanctions put on, the economic limits put on barley from Australia to China, there's only so much barley in the world and there is a global market for barley, so it just shifted. I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, people were shocked at, if you'd asked anyone, do we trade with Ukraine? People would say, well, no, surely we don't do anything. But, when it hit, suddenly we discovered, so much sunflower oil and sunflower seeds come from Ukraine and we use it in pet food and all sorts.
Well, I was shocked. I mean, when I started looking at Ukraine and what they exported, get out of here. What? Are you serious? That's it's a huge country, massive exporter.
So, I mean, it's noticeable when one country comes off the line like that. But, I think we all shift. I do think, though, I alluded to it earlier under the IRA, I think critical minerals, semiconductors, that there is going to be not a Cold War, so to speak, but there will be a line through the world for this market. Japan's already talking about restricting exports of the machines that make the high-end semiconductors to certain countries. I think there will be changes.
Yeah, that's going to be the biggest concern, that there's going to be sort of back to the east and west again. It's not necessarily it's going to be that it's going to be a different line, but there's going to be a line between us and them, which is not good for a globe.
No, and I think for supply chain managers, we talked about IRA and how that will drive, more traceability on supply chains. The other legislation that went through the US around the same time that doesn't get as much attention is the Uyghur Bill, which means that if you've got product coming from China you almost have to prove that you've not used slave labour from Uyghur minorities.
Which is not exactly easy.
Well, no, I mean, it's rare that you're guilty before then you have to prove yourself innocent. I think that is likely to expand, perhaps. I mean, if you think about, photovoltaics and all sorts of things, fabrics, China's done well to make sure that region of China is integrated in quite a lot of supply chains. So
it's becoming a bigger issue in ESG because it's the social part. You've got to make sure you don't buy stuff from that region because they're not going to match the social compliance. But it's where a lot of things come from. It's a challenge. Yeah.
Well, and how will you search for it? I mean, critical minerals, perhaps fabric. You can look at the DNA if you really want to. Yeah. But I mean, some of these things it's going to be tough.
And they hide it. It's deliberately hidden.
That's right. If you really want to hide it, you can.
We'll have to talk about that on another day because that's a whole section of itself. We've had a good chat. I really enjoyed talking about social norms and power differentials and whatever. But what I got out of the whole thing and with the digitalisation and digital trade, but what I got out of the whole thing is this overriding message from you from those decades of experience is just keep being positive. Go into those conversations with a positive approach and people will treat you the same way. Is that a summary of your worldview?
Yeah, I think, it's easy to spot differences amongst people. But one thing, I think what's kept me in international trade for so many years is that generally everyone involved is optimistic. You believe in the art of the possible. And that's why that's why we're so committed to trade.
And if all else fails, just go and drink beer. That's my view.
Or gin.
Gin. Well, gin's a gin. What's next for you? Are you travelling overseas in the next few months?
So I'm heading off to India with Ines for the G20 for the B20 meetings. I'm on, and then in October I'm back to Indonesia, Yogyakarta. I'm on the board of this great little unit called Achisus, which is on the advisory board, which is a joint venture between universities, and it sends Australian students to Indonesia under the new Colombo plan. So I think we send. I don't want to say the numbers because I'll get into trouble, but hundreds of Australian students for sort of 6 weeks to a semester to a year to Indonesia. And, as you've probably got a hint of, me studying overseas was such a formative experience. I'm really excited that I get to get Australians into that as well.
Indonesia, apart from the big cities, Indonesia is just
I love Yogyakarta. We went there in January for a holiday and after West Papua, and there's 40 universities. It's a university town.
Yeah.
You got to sit there and have your coffee with the hot coal so it doesn't go cold.
And for the people listening, I said Louise was an internationalist and multicultural. She spent her holidays canoeing around West Timor, West
Papua.
West Papua, yeah, as you do, I guess. It's been lovely having you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's good to see behind the curtain.
Yeah. Well, it all works properly. So that's it for another episode of Supply Circles. Thanks again to everyone for listening, and thanks for your feedback. If you have any feedback on today's interview with Louise or ideas for the show, or just want to give me some feedback, hit me up at james.scotland. That's just with one T, james.scotland@aigroup.com.au, or head over to my LinkedIn page. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back in a fortnight with more insights into the keys to building sustainable supply chains. Thanks for joining me. This is Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland. Bye for now.